On the morning that Colonel Arthur Blount was murdered, St. Mary Mead was doing what it generally did best, minding everyone else's business under the polite pretext of a village fete. It was the Vicar's Garden Bazaar, a yearly event of raffles, trestle tables, and tepid lemonade, elevated this year by the grand theme of the Cairo Bazaar, suggested by no less a person than Mrs. Bantry, who had once spent 3 whole days in Egypt and mentioned it whenever possible. There were faded shawls, brass coffee pots of uncertain origin, and a surprisingly sultry poster depicting a veiled dancer, which Mrs. Price Ridley had already complained about twice. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the jam stall with her knitting and a modest contribution of damson preserve, watched it all with her mild blue eyes. She had no particular fondness for bazaars, too much fuss and rather too many paper rosettes. But they were, she always thought, excellent opportunities to observe human nature under a thin veneer of charitable intention. "Quite like a souk, isn't it, Miss Marple?" breathed young Sylvia Blount, the Colonel's daughter, as she passed by in a flowing oriental scarf that made her look more like a child playing at theatricals than a denizen of Cairo. "Well, my dear," Miss Marple replied, "I have never actually been to a souk. But human nature is much the same in Market Street, or in the bazaars of Baghdad, I dare say." Sylvia laughed, though her eyes were shadowed. Miss Marple noticed the way the girl's gaze flickered, just once, to the far end of the lawn where Colonel Blount himself presided over the Oriental Curio stall. He stood ramrod straight in an old tropical suit. The brass sun of his regimental tie-pin flashed whenever he turned his head. "He would insist on wearing that awful suit," Sylvia murmured, half to herself. "Says it gives the proper colonial tone." She moved away before Miss Marple could answer, joining a group of young people gathered near the coconut shy. Miss Marple's fingers continued their quiet motion on her knitting needles. She did not look after Sylvia, but she was very much aware of the girl's quick, jerky step and the way she avoided the man at the curio stall. Colonel Blount's stall was, unmistakably, the attraction of the fitee. Spread over the table were small carved boxes, tarnished silver bangles, a pair of shockingly curved daggers, strings of bright glass beads, and, in the center, an odd little collection of yellowed papers in a glass-covered frame. A hand-lettered sign read, "Authentic papers from Cairo Bazaar." Subtle writing, very mysterious. Reverend Clement had privately expressed doubts as to the propriety of raffling heathen talismans, but Mrs. Bantry had swept such scruples aside. "My dear vicar, it's for the church roof. Besides, Colonel Blount swears they're nothing but old tourist rubbish, yet the villagers did not treat them as rubbish. They clustered round, peering at the curling scraps of paper, thick with indecipherable marks. Someone said they might be a code, someone else that they were a spell. Mrs. Bantry declared them a perfectly good conversation piece for any drawing room." Miss Marple, when she ambled near on the pretext of purchasing a bangle, regarded the frame with quiet interest. The writing, if it was writing, was in short, puzzling lines and little blocks, rather like children's attempts at copying letters they did not understand. One slip of paper had a faint brown stain upon it. Tea, perhaps, or something less domestic. Came with some odds and ends in Cairo just after the war. Colonel Blount was explaining in his hearty voice to Mr. Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, who had come down from London. Fellow in the bazaar swore they were some sort of secret instructions. Probably told every tourist that. "And are they?" asked Raymond, amused. "Instructions? Cipher? Nonsense." The Colonel's ruddy face darkened unexpectedly. "Just a lot of foreign scribble. They mean nothing at all." Miss Marple, who had known many men who protested too much, lifted her eyes from the papers and looked at Colonel Blount instead. It was later, when the band from Much Benham struck up a waltz, and most of the village drifted towards the tea tent, that the first scream shattered the hum of pleasant chat. It came from Sylvia Blount. They found Colonel Blount slumped behind his stall, his head at an unnatural angle, a jagged piece of one of his own Cairo daggers lying on the grass beside him. The glass frame that had held the mysterious papers lay empty, glittering in the sun. People began to press forward instinctively, drawn by that peculiar magnetism of disaster which polite society pretends not to possess. Mrs. Bantry dropped her paper plate of seed cake at Miss Marple's feet and seized her arm. "Jane, something's happened," she breathed, though it was perfectly obvious to everybody that something had indeed happened. Constable Palk, red in the face and important, hurried toward the marquee. The vicar met him halfway, speaking in a low tone that did not quite conceal its agitation. Several people caught the words doctor, and at once. The ripple went through the crowd like wind through corn. Miss Marple did not move toward the marquee. She knew from experience that there were always quite enough people immediately available to get in the way. Instead, she rose slowly, folded her knitting into her bag, and chose a position at a discreet distance where she could see without appearing to watch. Lydia Ashford, the Colonel's companion, was the first of his immediate circle to react. She pushed forward, her usually composed face abruptly drained of color. "Colonel Hemsley, what is it? Has he fainted?" she cried, but the vicar barred her way with a firmness that surprised those who thought of him solely as a mild man of God. "I'm afraid you must wait, Miss Ashford," he said gently. "Dr. Haydock is being sent for." Young David Thornton stood a little apart, his cigarette trembling in his hand. His eyes were fixed upon the marquee, but Miss Marple noticed that he had made no attempt to go nearer. Instead, he seemed to shrink back, as if physical proximity might somehow implicate him. "Shock," murmured Mrs. Bantry. "I remember when old Mr. Carmichael had his seizure in the post office. I do not think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that the vicar would look quite like that for a mere seizure." The village doctor arrived in his small car within minutes, summoned at a run by an eager Boy Scout. Dr. Haydock's brusque voice could be heard from within the marquee, followed by a heavy silence. When at last he emerged, his expression confirmed what most of them had already guessed. "I'm afraid Colonel Hemsley is dead," he announced, looking directly at Constable Palk. "Best if we clear the area. No one is to enter the tent without police permission." There was a collective intake of breath, followed by the sibilant stirring of voices. Dead. The word hung in the summer air like an unexpected cloud. "How?" demanded Mrs. Bantry, always forthright. Haydock hesitated. "I should like to be certain before I say anything more." His eyes moved briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the marquee. "Palk, you know what to do. Telephone the chief constable. This will not be for the village constable alone." Miss Marple watched as the crowd began to break into small, fervent clusters. Speculation flowered at once. "His heart," said Mrs. Price Ridley with gloomy satisfaction. "I always said a man of his color couldn't be healthy." "Nonsense," snapped Mrs. Bantry. "He was as strong as an ox. More likely a stroke." "Or something he ate," suggested Miss Hartnell, glancing accusingly at the tea tent as if the cucumber sandwiches might be silently conspiring. Raymond Pierce, the solicitor, stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. He had the cautious look of a man calculating unseen consequences. "Doctor," he said, "I was acting in certain matters for Colonel Hemsley. If there is any question of, unnatural causes, I should be informed." Haydock gave him a sharp look. "You shall be, Pierce, when there is anything definite to be said." Inside the marquee, Miss Marple knew. The Colonel lay beyond caring, with the ornate Cairo cipher box somewhere near at hand. She reflected, with that mild air of hers, that it was always the same. Where there is talk of sudden fortune, there is often sudden death. Her gaze drifted to Lydia Ashford, now sitting rigidly on a folding chair, her hands clenched together so tightly that the knuckles shone white. Then to David Thornton, still apart, still watching. And finally to the solicitor, whose lips were pressed into a thin line. Such excitement, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Bantry. It does remind one rather of that affair with Mrs. Hudson's legacy and the poisoned raspberry jam. Human nature, you know, has such a tendency to repeat itself. Poisoned, exclaimed Mrs. Bantry, seizing upon the word. "Oh, Jane, you don't really think?" "I?" said Miss Marple mildly. "I think nothing at all yet. But I am afraid," she added, as Constable Palk began officiously shepherding people away, "that this year's fifth will be wovery much talked of in St. Mary Mead for a good long time to come." Inspector Slack descended from the police motor car with his usual air of brisk irritation, as though murder were a personal inconvenience deliberately contrived to disrupt his day. He was a solid, square-shouldered man, with a jaw that seemed to have been designed for disapproval, and he wasted no time asserting his authority over the assembled villages. Now then," he barked, striding across the lawn toward the marquee. "No more of this gossiping and milling about. Constable Palk, you'll keep everyone here until I've taken their names and statements. Dr. Haydock, I'll want your preliminary findings as soon as you're ready." He spared Miss Marple a cursory nod, one that suggested long acquaintance with her presence at inconveniently intricate crimes, and then disappeared into the marquee. Inside, the murmur of voices resumed at once, with a new edge of excitement now that the machinery of official investigation had been set in motion. Miss Marple, who had not been asked to move, saw no reason to do so. She merely shifted her chair a few inches to obtain a better view of the marquee entrance, and resumed her knitting. Her fingers moved, but her eyes remained alert, taking in the smallest movements of those around her. The way Lydia Ashford adjusted her hat 3 times in as many minutes, the way Raymond Pierce kept checking his watch, the way David Thornton had lit a second cigarette from the first, burning it, down almost to the filter without seeming to notice. After some minutes, Inspector Slack emerged, his expression dour. He conferred briefly with Dr. Haydock, then turned to address the crowd. "Right," he said. "Colonel Hemsley appears to have met his death under circumstances that are," he cleared his throat, plainly disliking the word, "suspicious. Nobody is to leave the vicarage until I've spoken to you. This is a police matter now, and I'll thank you all to remember that wild speculation helps no one." "Quite," murmured Miss Marple under her breath, watching as 3 separate groups immediately embarked on even wilder speculation than before. Inspector Slack's eye fell on the cipher box, still resting on a table where Constable Palk had placed it. That the thing he was making such a song and dance about? Slack asked. "Yes, sir," said Palk. "Colonel called it the Cairo Cipher. Said it held a secret to some kind of treasure. The key's missing." Slack tilted the box, examining the Arabic script with no great enthusiasm. "We'll have that down at the station. If there's anything valuable about it, that could be a motive. Right enough." Miss Marple noticed how 3 people reacted to this pronouncement. Lydia Ashford's lips thinned, Raymond Pierce's shoulders tightened, and the Colonel's niece, Miss Eleanor Vale, that was her name, stared at the box with a look of mingled dread and longing that struck Miss Marple as highly suggestive of prior acquaintance. "Miss Vale, is it?" Slack called, scanning a hastily compiled list from Constable Palk. "I'd like a word with you first, if you please." Inside the vicarage, Eleanor started, as though pulled from some grim internal reverie, and followed him with the uncertain gait of a person walking toward a sentence rather than a conversation. Mrs. Bantry leaned down to Miss Marple, whispering, "Do you think she did it, Jane?" She was seen arguing with the Colonel only yesterday, near the post office. Mrs. Bartlett heard raised voices, Mrs. Bartlett often hears raised voices where there are only draughts, Dolly, Miss Marple replied mildly, though I dare say Miss Vale has reasons to resent her uncle. Families can be very unkind about money matters. Money? You think it's about his will, then? My dear, when an elderly man with means changes his testamentary arrangements twice in as many months, as I happen to know Colonel Hemsley did, there is bound to be ill feeling. I recollect a most unpleasant business in Littlehampton, when a retired tea merchant altered his will in favor of a lady's companion. There was nearly a murder that time, too, though it resolved itself in quite another fashion. Slack, meanwhile, had begun his orderly questioning. One by one, the fete-goers were ushered into the vicarage study, emerging some minutes later with faces that betrayed varying degrees of discomfort. Miss Vale came out blotting her eyes with a handkerchief. Raymond Pierce emerged tight-lipped. Lydia Ashford appeared composed, but her fingers continually sought the small gold locket at her throat. Miss Marple noted each of these details with quiet interest. Statements, she knew, were useful, but reactions were more so. People lied with their tongues far more easily than with their hands or their eyes. At last, inevitably, Inspector Slack's gaze settled once more on the elderly lady seated by the jam stall. Miss Marple, he said, approaching with the resigned air of a man facing an unavoidable chore, I suppose I'd better take your statement as well. Of course, Inspector, Miss Marple replied pleasantly, rising with a little effort. I don't imagine I can tell you anything of importance. I merely sat and knitted. Yes, said Slack, with a hint of irony, you usually do. And yet, as she followed him toward the vicarage, Miss Marple's mind was already arranging the afternoon's events into patterns. Somewhere amid the flutter of bunting, the exotic trappings of the Cairo Bazaar, and the very English fears of those present, the truth was quietly waiting to be noticed. Inspector Slack's voice cut briskly through the rising murmur. Constable Palk, you'll take 2 men and see if you can locate Miss Clara Hemsley. She can't have got far on foot. Check the road toward the station and the lanes by Manor Farm. I want her brought here at once for questioning. As Palk hurried off, Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, folding her knitting with neat precision. Mrs. Bantry, still flustered but inwardly delighted by the drama, touched her arm. You'll come into the vicarage, won't you, Jane? They'll be taking statements, I suppose. And really, you saw almost everything. My dear Dolly, Miss Marple replied. I saw very little. But one may have noticed 1 or 2 tiny things. It is often the tiny things which matter. Inside the vicarage drawing-room, the atmosphere was thick with heat, strong tea, and suppressed excitement. Chairs had been hastily arranged in a semicircle. The villagers sat or stood according to temperament and conscience. Mrs. Price Ridley had installed herself in a position that allowed maximum view and minimum responsibility. David Thornton hovered near the window, as if contemplating flight. Miss Lydia Ashford sat bolt upright on the edge of a hard chair, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Inspector Slack stood before the fireplace, notebook open. We'll proceed in an orderly manner, he announced. Dr. Haydock, you'll remain on hand. Mr. Clement has kindly allowed us the use of this room. Reverend Clement nodded, his thin face still pale. Griselda, his wife, swept in with a tray of tea, a gesture both hospitable and strategic. We shall all feel better with something in our hands, she said lightly, even if it is only a cup. Miss Marple's eyes, however, went not to the cups but to the sugar bowl. Griselda, with the ease of long habit, spooned sugar into her husband's cup without asking, then handed Miss Marple a cup, setting the bowl deliberately within reach. You don't take sugar, do you, Miss Marple? She remarked casually. No, my dear, Miss Marple said. I never have. And as she said it, she remembered distinctly having seen Colonel Hemsley, Only last week at the Blue Boar, grumbling about people who ruined good tea with sugar. It was one of those minor dislikes that people aired with great regularity. "Mrs. Meadows first," Slack said. "You brought the tea?" "Yes, sir." Mrs. Meadows twisted her apron. I poured it out from the pot in the kitchen, put it on the tray with the sugar bowl, same one there, and took it myself to the Colonel. He said, "Just in time, my good woman," and reached for the cup. Then I left. "Did you see him add sugar?" Slack asked. "No, sir. My back was turned almost at once. But the cup in there, it's got sugar in it. I tasted it when the doctor said it was poison. Sweet as anything it was, before that horrible bitterness." Miss Marple's eyes lowered thoughtfully. A man who disliked sugar, a sugared cup. Lydia Ashford was called next. Her manner was self-controlled, her voice low and well-bred. "I was employed as Colonel Hemsley's companion," she said. "I accompanied him from Egypt 3 months ago and have been staying at the Crown Hotel in Much Benham until suitable accommodation was found. I came here today at his request to assist with the display." "Your relationship was good?" Slack asked, watching her narrowly. "Entirely correct," she replied. "Colonel Hemsley was a difficult man, but he was generous when it suited him. Did you know about this cipher business?" He gestured irritably toward the window, beyond which the marquee was just visible. "I knew he had something he believed valuable," she said carefully. "He spoke of it often. He was afraid someone might take it. He mentioned once that an old associate from Cairo was threatening him. I assumed it was idle talk." Miss Marple detected the faintest hesitation, as if Lydia had decided, quite deliberately, what to omit. David Thornton was more transparently nervous. He stammered his way through an account of sketching the marquee, seeing Clara Hemsley pass by in obvious agitation, and hearing raised voices between the Colonel and Mr. Pierce earlier in the afternoon. Raised voices, were they? Slack pounced. "What about?" "I couldn't hear," David said, "but it sounded angry. The Colonel shouted something about blackmail and not a penny more." All eyes swung to Mr. Raymond Pierce, who stiffened indignantly. "This is absurd," he protested. "Our discussion concerned legal fees, and no more. Young Mr. Thornton clearly delights in drama." Miss Marple, watching, thought of something else. How very neatly the figure of Miss Clara Hemsley had slipped to the center of suspicion. Too neatly, perhaps, for her liking. As the last of the 50 stalls were dismantled under Inspector Slack's gruff orders, the vicarage lawn took on a strangely desolate appearance. Only the marquee, the tea table, and the guarded cipher box remained as mute testimony to the afternoon's calamity. The villagers had been allowed to disperse at last, on condition that they remain available for further questioning. Miss Marple, having declined Mrs. Bantry's well-meant offer of a lift home, lingered near the edge of the lawn with an air of gentle aimlessness that deceived no one who truly knew her. "I really must be getting back, Jane, Mrs. Bantry said, glancing nervously toward the marquee. "I shall lie awake all night wondering about that dreadful box. Do you suppose it truly contains a map to treasure?" "I suspect," Miss Marple replied mildly, "that whatever it contains, my dear, it is rather less romantic than that and infinitely more troublesome." Inspector Slack, still conferring with Constable Palk, caught sight of her and seemed to hesitate, torn between irritation and a reluctant respect born of previous cases in which her quiet insights had proven inconveniently accurate. "Miss Marple," he said at last, coming over with his notebook conspicuously closed, "you were nearby when the body was found. Notice anything unusual?" "Only what one always notices in such unfortunate circumstances, Inspector," Miss Marple answered. "People behaving quite unlike themselves." Slack frowned. "Meaning?" Well, she went on in her gentle, meandering way. Miss Ashford, for instance, did not inquire once whether her employer might possibly still be alive. I have often observed that companions, governesses and such, who have suffered from a difficult temperament in their employers, nevertheless tend to react with a sort of shocked concern at the moment of crisis. It is very human. You know, after relying on someone's existence for one's bread and butter. And you think she didn't? He asked sharply. I think Miss Ashford reacted, Miss Marple said, as a woman whose most pressing thought was not death, but what death might mean for her arrangements. Inspector Slack made a non-committal noise, but his pencil reappeared briefly. I'll talk to her again, but the niece, now threatening letter, known quarrels, turning up on the day he dies, trying to run off to the station. Not running off, Inspector, Miss Marple corrected gently, sitting and crying. People do not usually choose railway benches for concealment. Hedgerows are so much more obliging. He gave her a look which implied that hedgerows did not feature in official police training. Motives enough with her. And this Cairo business, fraud, angry investors. Someone was bound to catch up with him. Miss Marple inclined her head. Oh yes, Colonel Hemsley appears to have given a great many people reasons to dislike him. But poison, Inspector, poison is such an intimate method, don't you think? So very domestic. She let her gaze rest briefly on the tea tray. Slack followed it. We know it was in the tea. Doctor's quite clear, he said. Housekeeper brings tea at 5 to 3. Colonel alone intent. Poison goes in some time before he drinks it. Either she did it, or someone slipped in after. Or, Miss Marple said softly, the poison was already waiting for him, long before the tray left the vicarage kitchen. Slack stared. What do you mean by that? Only that sugar bowls, she replied, are the most democratic of arrangements. If one wishes to administer cyanide, what could be more convenient than a lump of sugar that might be placed in anyone's cup? It reminds me very much of poor Mr. Withers at Little Upton, whose habit of helping himself from the communal sugar basin led to, well, a very awkward funeral. The Colonel's cup was the only one used, Slack objected. No one else had tea from that tray. Yes, Miss Marple agreed gently. Which is what troubles me. When a method would easily allow for several victims, yet only one is taken, one must ask oneself whether the arrangement is quite as straightforward as it appears. Particularly when the supposed sugar lover was, until quite recently, such a vehement opponent of sweetened tea. She watched him closely. He frowned again. What's that? Opponent of, you're sure of that? Quite, said Miss Marple. Colonel Hemsley expressed himself very strongly on the subject only last week at the Blue Boar. People do not change such settled habits overnight, I find, unless someone is very anxious that others should believe they have changed. Inspector Slack made another brief note, though his expression suggested he regarded this as the sort of unhelpful subtlety elderly ladies specialized in. We'll have that sugar tested, he muttered. If there's cyanide in it, that narrows things down. Miss Marple said nothing, but her hands were very still on her knitting. She did not, in fact, believe it would be found. Someone had been cleverer than that. As she finally allowed Mrs. Bantry to shepherd her toward the waiting car, Miss Marple's eyes drifted past the marquee to where David Thornton stood by the church wall, smoking furiously, and to Miss Ashford, who was speaking quietly with Mr. Pierce, her face turned away from the police. In a small village like St. Mary Mead, people's patterns were remarkably consistent. And this afternoon, several patterns had shifted in the most interesting ways. Behind the vicarage marquee, the air felt cooler, the noise of the crowd fading to a dull murmur. The grass here was less trampled, and the hedge, high and neatly clipped, cast a deep green shadow along the narrow strip of lawn that bordered the lane. Miss Marple paused, her eyes moving with slow, unhurried care over the ground. Years of tending village gardens had taught her what plants looked like when left alone, and what they looked like when something, or someone, had disturbed them. At the base of the hedge, just where the canvas of the marquee brushed the leaves, the earth was scuffed. The grass was flattened in a faint, irregular oval, too small for the vicar's wheelbarrow, too deliberate for a dog. A footprint, she thought. Not a clear one, for the ground was dry, but a hurried impression all the same. The canvas wall of the marquee bulged inward slightly. Miss Marple, after a quick glance to make sure Inspector Slack was still holding court near the cipher box, gently lifted the hem and peered inside. It gave her a different perspective on the scene of the crime, the small trestle table, the teacup now ringed with cyanide-dusted residue, the wobbly wooden chair on which Colonel Hemsley had last sat alive. If one were to stand here, she reflected, half concealed by the hedge, one could lift the canvas a fraction and slip in unseen, just long enough to drop something into a sugar bowl or exchange a harmless teacup for a deadly one. She let the canvas fall and straightened slowly, her hands resting lightly on her walking stick. The footprint in the grass, the discarded key in the rose bed, the empty cipher box, all small things. But small things were often where truth chose to hide. From the other side of the garden came the raised voice of Inspector Slack. "You admit to threatening him, Thornton. You admit to losing a considerable sum to his bogus expedition. You admit he refused to repay you. Now he's dead, poisoned, and you were seen loitering near his tent. That's a fair bit more than coincidence." David Thornton's reply carried a thin edge of despair. "Threatening to demand my money is not the same as murder. I didn't go near his tea. I swear it." Miss Marple thought of young men she had known long ago, easily angered, easily led, often foolish, but not necessarily wicked. Thornton's temper might be hot, but his reactions thus far had not suggested the cold calculation required for cyanide and fake ciphers. Her eyes strayed instead toward Miss Lydia Ashford, who had retreated to a bench beneath the laburnum tree, sitting with her hands folded very precisely in her lap. Her face was still, but too still, like a mask held in place by sheer will. In an older lady from St. Mary Mead, such stillness might have meant resignation. In a paid companion who had just lost her employer, and perhaps her position, it suggested something else. Control. Miss Marple remembered how Lydia had spoken to Thornton, not like a servant to a mere acquaintance, but like one conspirator to another. "We had an agreement." Agreements often meant leverage. And leverage, in Miss Marple's long acquaintance with human nature, so often led to fear. Fear, again, she thought. The same thing that had made Colonel Hemsley's eyes flick toward the gate all morning. The same thing that had made Clara hurry to the 50. The same thing that now sat like a shadow behind Lydia Ashford's carefully folded hands. Returning quietly to her wicker chair, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Mrs. Bantry hastened to her, eager for any confidential remark. "Well, Jane, what do you make of it now? Do you believe that poor young man did it? He looks so utterly wretched." "People can look very wretched when misfortune catches up with them, Dolly," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Guilt is by no means the only cause of misery. Sometimes it is merely having chosen one's friends unwisely." "You mean that Miss Ashford?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice with relish. "I mean," Miss Marple said, eyes on her needles, "that arrangements involving money and secrets rarely remain cordial for long. I have noticed that in our village as often as in the newspapers." Across the lawn, Inspector Slack announced that everyone was to go home, but remain available for further questioning. The 50, such as it was over. Cakes sat uneaten, the jam stall abandoned. The Cairo Bazaar banner flapped forlornly in the evening breeze. Miss Marple, rising with some apparent difficulty, and accepting Mrs. Bantry's arm, glanced once more at the marquee, at the empty cipher box, and at the narrow strip of grass behind the hedge. By tonight, she decided, it would be necessary to pay a social call, perhaps on Mr. Pierce, who knew so much about legal trouble, or on Miss Ashford, who knew so much more about the Colonel than she had yet chosen to say. Human nature, she reflected, was wonderfully consistent. Sooner or later, someone would behave just as someone else had behaved before, and when they did, she would recognize it. Inspector Slack, however, was not a man easily diverted from a theory once embraced. He tightened his grip on David Thornton's arm, as though Miss Marple's quiet remark were no more than an annoying drought fluttering his paperwork. Tea's poisoned, cyanide's found among this young man's possessions, and he's admitted to being swindled by the victim, Slack declared firmly. That's motive, means, and opportunity. Diabetic or not, the Colonel is dead of cyanide, and this fellow had enough of it to kill an army. David struggled against the constable's hold, his voice cracking with desperation. I used it for my photographs. Ask anyone. I've had those chemicals for months. I never went near his tea. I didn't even know he was diabetic. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward Miss Ashford at that last statement. The companion's face remained pale, but her eyes flickered in a way that suggested she did know about the Colonel's condition, intimately so. A wife, Miss Marple reflected, generally has to understand such things. A mere employee might not. Inspector, Miss Marple ventured mildly. If Mr. Thornton had wished to kill Colonel Hemsley, surely he could have done so during one of their private quarrels over the money, without resorting to so public and elaborate a method? Slack snorted. You're forgetting he wanted the money back. Killing the man in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, gives him an alibi of sorts. No one expects murder to happen in the middle of a fete. On the contrary, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, it is precisely where one might expect a clever murderer to strike. Crowds create confusion, and confusion hides the smallest, most telling details. Her eyes rested again on the jam stall. A thought, faint as the first thread of smoke from a distant fire, began to take shape. At that moment, Dr. Haydock Ray emerged from the marquee, his sleeves rolled up and his manner brisk. I've completed a more thorough preliminary examination, he announced. The cyanide was certainly fast-acting, ingested, not inhaled. But I'll say this, the concentration was very high, enough to kill almost instantly. In 1 cup of tea? Miss Marple asked, raising her eyebrows. The doctor hesitated. Well, not exactly. From what I can tell, the distribution in his stomach is irregular. More like a bolus, I'd say. A lump of something strongly impregnated with cyanide, swallowed more or less whole and then dissolving. Miss Marple's fingers tightened momentarily on her knitting. A lump, she repeated softly. Sugar, perhaps? Or something very much like it. Mrs. Bantry, who had been listening with obvious fascination, gave a little shudder. Jane, are you suggesting someone poisoned a single lump of sugar? But if the Colonel never took sugar, then perhaps, Miss Marple interrupted gently, the sugar was not meant for him at all. A small silence followed this remark, like the pause before a distant storm is heard. Her words seemed to ripple outward, rearranging the mental picture in several minds at once. From near the tea tent came a sudden exclamation. My samples! Cried Mrs. Bartlett, the stout woman in charge of the jam stall. Inspector, you'd best come and look at this. They all moved toward the stall, though Miss Marple, with characteristic unobtrusiveness, allowed herself to drift toward the back of the group. Mrs. Bartlett pointed to a small tray of taster spoons and empty sample jars. I could have sworn, she said, flustered, that I prepared 12 little pots of apricot jam this morning for the tasting. But when I counted just now, There were only 11 in the crate, and this one, she held up a tiny jar with a smear of amber at the bottom, looks as though it's been used and then wiped out in a hurry. And none of the ladies at the stall recall serving it. Miss Marple peered at the jar. A faint, sharp tang lingered beneath the sugary fragrance, so faint that most noses would miss it entirely, but not hers. She had smelled something very like it once before, long ago, when a maid in St. Mary Mead had tried to rid herself of a most unsatisfactory fianc by tinkering with his rat poison. Apricot, she repeated softly, such a pretty, harmless flavor. Almost identical in color to, well, certain chemicals. Under the right circumstances. Inspector Slack frowned, irritation battling with dawning unease. What exactly are you driving at, Miss Marple? She looked up at him with her usual mildness. Only this, Inspector, that perhaps we have been looking at the wrong cup, and possibly even the wrong intended victim. It is so easy, in a crowd, for the wrong hand to reach for the wrong thing. And as she said it, her eyes went not to David Thornton, but to Miss Lydia Ashford, who, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid. Even with Miss Ashford's cool confession hanging in the air, Miss Marple felt an odd sense of dissatisfaction, as though a picture had been hastily framed while several crucial pieces still lay scattered on the table. Inspector Slack, however, looked delighted. He snapped the handcuffs on Lydia Ashford, Lydia Hemsley, with rather more relish than professional necessity. You've admitted to administering poison with intent to kill. That's quite enough for me. Constable Palk, take Mrs. Hemsley into custody. We'll sort the rest down at the station. As Lydia was led away, David Thornton sagged with visible relief, his shoulders slumping as though a great weight had been lifted. Yet Miss Marple noticed that his eyes followed the departing woman with a mixture of resentment and fear, not simple gratitude for his reprieve. Clara Hemsley stood apart from the others, her tear-stained face turned toward the dimming sky. Morrison, the archaeologist, was speaking to her in low, reassuring tones, but Clara's gaze kept drifting toward the empty cipher box with a kind of weary bitterness. So it was Lydia all along. Mrs. Bantry murmured to Miss Marple as the fifth slowly disintegrated into small knots of speculative gossip. Poisoning his special diabetic sweets. Really, Jane, it's almost poetic. Miss Marple's knitting had resumed its gentle click-click. Yes, Dolly, almost too poetic. Rather like those modern novels where the authoress is determined to make her villainess strikingly symmetrical in her sins. It satisfies the reader, but life, I find, so rarely tidies itself quite so conveniently. Mrs. Bantry stared. You don't think she did it? Oh, I think she killed him, Miss Marple said mildly. She is entirely believable as a woman who would nurse a grievance until it blossomed into murder. What troubles me is not the manner of his death, but the embroidery. Embroidery? The poisoned tea, Dolly. The sugar bowl specially requested. The telegram about Cairo. The empty cipher box. That is all most elaborate for a crime that was already insured by a simple sweetmeat in a waistcoat pocket. One doesn't generally light a bonfire to hide the smoke from a match. By early evening, the vicarage lawn was deserted, save for trampled grass and paper bunting snagged in the hedges. Colonel Hemsley's body had been removed. Lydia Hemsley conveyed to Much Benham, and the villagers had retreated to their respective parlors to pick over the day's events with the relish of those safely uninvolved. Miss Marple, after a late cup of cocoa and a few soothing rows of stocking stitch, retired to bed at her neat little cottage on the high street with her knitting bag, now containing the cipher key and the documents from behind the hedge, placed carefully on the chair beside her. She had not been asleep long when a sound brought her instantly awake, a soft scrape at the back window, followed by the faint rattle of a sash being cautiously tested. Miss Marple did not cry out. Instead, she slipped silently from bed, wrapped herself in her dressing gown, and moved with surprising quietness for someone of her age to the landing. From there she had a narrow angle on the sitting room, where the silhouette of a figure was now visible, thin, nervous movements, pausing often as though listening. The intruder went straight, not to the silver, not to the small writing desk, but to the chair where Miss Marple's knitting bag lay. The bag was opened with frantic haste. The faint rustle of papers, the quick exhalation of relief, then a muffled curse of frustration as the intruder realized that what they sought was not there. For Miss Marple, who had anticipated precisely this, had removed the most interesting documents from her bag before going to bed and tucked them under the loose board beneath her bedside rug, a trick learned long ago from a housemaid who distrusted visiting relatives. Satisfied she had seen enough, Miss Marple quietly retreated to her room. She had recognized the figure's outline quite clearly in the faint streetlight, the sloping shoulders, the nervous hands. Mr. Raymond Pierce, the village solicitor. In the morning, the village would awaken to fresh scandal. The vicarage safe had been found rifled, Colonel Hemsley's papers missing, the cipher box removed from police custody when Constable Palk had dozed in his chair. The murder, it seemed, had not been the end of the affair at all, but merely its beginning. Dusk was beginning to creep over the vicarage garden when Miss Marple, instead of following the general drift toward the gate, seated herself once more in her wicker chair. Her eyes were thoughtful, her hands calmly busy with the familiar click of needles. Inspector Slack, having dispatched Constable Palk to telephone for additional officers, turned back to her with a mixture of grudging respect and lingering uncertainty. "So," he said, scratching his chin, "we've got Mrs. Hemsley for murder, Miss Clara Hemsley for attempted murder, and Pierce for theft and tampering with evidence. Complicated, but straightforward enough in the end." "I wonder," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze resting briefly on Clara, who sat rigid and white-faced on a nearby bench. "It is a curious thing, Inspector, how guilt shows itself, or does not show itself, as the case may be." Slack frowned. "You think one of them is lying still?" "Oh, I think several of them are lying," Miss Marple said mildly. "The question is, about what, precisely?" She allowed this to hang for a moment, then added with apparent irrelevance, "You know, this whole affair reminds me very much of poor Mrs. Edgeworth and the poisoned blancmange." Mrs. Bantry, who knew these reminiscences always led somewhere, brightened. "The one where the housemaid put arsenic in the pudding and then fainted before she could serve it?" "Exactly, Dolly. You see, the housemaid believed herself capable of murder, but when it came to the actual act, her nerve failed her." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Clara. "I do not think Miss Hemsley poisoned anything at all." Clara stared at her as though she had misheard. Inspector Slack gave an incredulous snort. "But you said—" "I said she planned to," Miss Marple corrected gently, "which is rather different from doing so. Our dear Clara is a clever girl with a lively imagination and a very dramatic sense of her own misery. She wrote the forged note about the sugar, she crept in by the back lane to place it where Mrs. Meadows would find it, but when it came to actually handling the cyanide, she lost her nerve. Clara's hands flew to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice came in a rush. I couldn't. I took the crystals I stole from Mr. Thornton. I even brought an empty sugar packet, but when I stood there with the spoon in my hand, I felt sick. Uncle Alistair had been beastly, but he was still family. I put the poison back in my bag and ran out the back way. I thought, if someone saw me, at least they'd think I'd visited him. Very natural, Miss Marple said kindly. And afterwards, when you learned he had died of cyanide poisoning, you thought your mere intention made you as guilty as if you had actually done it. Sensitive consciences are sometimes quite illogical. Inspector Slack looked from Clara to Miss Marple, deeply annoyed but unable to refute the quiet certainty in the old lady's voice. Then, who did poison the tea? If no one, why all the shamming with sugar and forged notes? Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. Ah, but that, Inspector, is the cleverest part of all. You and everyone else assumed the tea was the vehicle of the crime, as you were meant to. It drew attention away from the Turkish delight, which was the true method. And who would benefit most from that misdirection? Not Clara, who didn't know about the sweets. Not Mr. Pierce, who only thought of himself after the fact. Her gaze moved at last to the quiet figure who had remained so composed since her confession. Lydia Hemsley watched Miss Marple with an expressionless calm that, now, seemed almost too perfect. You see, Miss Marple continued gently, Mrs. Hemsley is clever enough to know that cyanide is traced easily from a sweet placed in the mouth. But if there was also cyanide in the tea, why? Then all the clever doctors and policemen would say, "Ah, he drank poisoned tea," and never looked beyond the cup. For the first time, something like true alarm flickered in Lydia's eyes. "You are suggesting," she said slowly, "that I poisoned the tea as well as the Turkish delight?" "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple replied, and her voice, though kind, had steel beneath it. "I am suggesting something far more interesting. That you never poisoned the Turkish delight at all." The garden seemed to still around them. A robin hopped on the path nearby, unnoticed. Lydia's knuckles whitened around her handbag. "Because," Miss Marple went on, almost conversationally, "there is one very small, very human fact that makes your story quite impossible." For a long moment after Morrison's quiet confession, the garden was utterly still. The bunting fluttered faintly in the evening breeze, the teacups and jam jars and toppled coconut shies standing as mute reminders that this had begun as nothing more sinister than a village 50. Inspector Slack recovered first. "You're admitting to murder, then," he said, though his voice was no longer triumphant, merely weary. "Premeditated. You brought the poison back from Cairo." Morrison nodded. "I had it compounded there, under the guise of research chemicals. I'd studied enough toxicology to know how to delay the onset. I took rooms at the Blue Boar and watched his routines. Every morning at 8 he ordered coffee in his room. When the maid left the tray in the corridor, I spoke to her through my half-open door, said I was Hemsley's associate, and would take it in. She was flustered, in a hurry. I doubt she even looked at me. Dr. Haydock rubbed his chin. That would explain it. A slow-acting dose, absorbing over hours, with perhaps a final trigger from something he ate. By 3 o'clock, the cumulative effect would be inevitable. Mrs. Hemsley gave a sharp, bitter laugh. So all my careful planning, the marriage, the pretense, the poisoned sweets, was for nothing. He was already as good as dead. And my tea, Clara whispered, horrified. And David's chemicals and Mr. Pierce's petty theft. She broke off, covering her face. We all stooped so low, for nothing, not for nothing, Miss Marple said gently. It has shown each of you something about yourselves that you might otherwise never have known. That is a kind of accounting too. Inspector Slack straightened, duty reasserting itself. Thomas Morrison, I am arresting you on suspicion of the willful murder of Colonel Alistair Hemsley. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say, there's no need, Morrison interrupted quietly. I've said what matters. Constable Park led him away toward the waiting motor car. Several villagers watched in stricken silence. Others turned aside, suddenly intent on collapsing chairs or collecting plates, as though by tidying the physical disorder, they might somehow restore moral order as well. Mrs. Bantry exhaled, shakily. 3 would be murderers. one actual murderer, and half the village dabbling in fraud or theft. Jane, it's quite appalling. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. It is rather like my Aunt Fanny's Christmas pudding, she observed. People always assume the silver sixpence is the only thing hidden inside, but once she accidentally put in 3 by mistake. Caused the most dreadful quarrels until each one was found. Human nature, Dolly. Once greed or hatred has been stirred, everyone goes hunting for their own little treasure, and often bites on something very hard and painful instead. By the time the twilight deepened into proper evening, the buffet had been dismantled. The exotic awnings of the Cairo Bazaar were folded away, brass coffee pots packed into crates, and the once prized cipher box, now just an empty curiosity, lay tagged among the police exhibits. The vicarage lawn, relieved of its spectacle, looked oddly bare and honest. Later, in the quiet of her sitting room on the high street, Miss Marple poured herself a modest cup of cocoa and reflected on the day's events. The newspaper she had been knitting from lay folded beside her. The little brass key to the cipher box glinted faintly where she had placed it on the mantelpiece. So many intersecting motives, she thought. Clara's wounded entitlement, Mrs. Hemsley's long-nursed vengeance, Pierce's cowardly fear for his reputation, Thornton's desperation over lost savings, and behind them all, Morrison's deep, cold grief, quite respectable on the surface, but turned inward until it hardened into something very like fanaticism. She thought of Colonel Hemsley himself, charming to some, cruel to many, supremely confident that he could manipulate others and escape the consequences. In a sense, he had been right. No court could have touched him in Cairo. It had taken the complicated machinery of hurt human hearts to do what the law could not. The next morning, villagers would return to their routines. Mrs. Price Ridley would decry foreign influences. Mr. Abbott would weigh out rashers and gossip. Mrs. Meadows would lay the vicar's breakfast with slightly shaking hands. The Cairo Bazaar would become a story, then a warning, then eventually only a faintly scandalous anecdote told over tea. Miss Marple finished her cocoa and set down the cup with a small decisive click. Somewhere, she knew, people would comfort themselves that such things did not really happen among ordinary, respectable folk. But in St. Mary Mead, where she had watched human nature play out in all its small domestic variations, she knew better. Murder, she reflected, was rarely an isolated thunderclap from a clear sky. It was more often the final crack in ice that had been thinning for a very long time. She picked up her knitting again, the steady rhythm of her needles as reassuring as church bells in the distance. Outside, the village settled into its familiar peace, outwardly untouched, inwardly altered in ways most of its inhabitants would never entirely understand. But Miss Marple understood, and that, she thought without pride or satisfaction, was why the truth so often found its way, however reluctantly, to her quiet front room. In the days that followed, the Cairo Bazaar became less an event than a landmark in the village calendar, spoken of, referred to, and delicately circled around, as one might walk around a patch of soft ground that had once been a bog. Perhaps the most curious thing, Miss Marple reflected, was how quickly people began to adjust, weaving the horror into the ordinary fabric of village life. The newspapers, of course, descended in due form. Miss Marple watched from her cottage window as 2 energetic young men with notebooks and untidy hair interviewed Mrs. Bantry at her front gate. Mrs. Bantry, delighted by the attention, gave a dramatic account of the whole dreadful business, in which Miss Marple observed herself mentioned only as a dear soul, very quiet, hardly noticed a thing. This amused her greatly. At the Blue Boar, the landlord discovered that our murder, as he came to call it, was remarkably good for trade. Visitors from neighboring villages drove in on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly for luncheon but in truth to inspect the precise corner table where Colonel Hemsley had once ranted about sugar and fate without knowing either would shortly concern him so intimately. Clara Hemsley left St. Mary Mead sooner than expected. Officialdom, after much consideration, accepted that her poisoned tea scheme had remained in the realm of intention rather than act. There was stern talk of moral culpability, of course, and a quietly handled agreement that she would remove herself to a cousin in Surrey. Miss Marple saw her off at the station, a pale, chastened figure with a single valise and a new, sober gravity about the eyes. "You will find, my dear," Miss Marple said gently as the train's steam began to billow, "that living decently, day by day, is a duller sort of courage than desperate acts, but far more useful in the end." Clara's fingers tightened around her ticket. "I shall remember that, Miss Marple," she said, and Miss Marple believed that, for once, the words were not merely polite. Mrs. Lydia Hemsley, no longer Miss Ashford, no longer anything at all in village terms, remained in custody while the legal machinery ground forward. From time to time, a line or two appeared in the papers, further developments in the St. Mary Mead murder, or alleged co-conspirator in Cairo fraud case. Mrs. Price Ridley read each one aloud at the ladies' sewing circle, finishing invariably with, "I always said nothing good came of foreign marriages." No one quite dared remind her that the same had once been said of her own brother's unfortunate elopement to Brighton. Raymond Pierce returned to his office above the High Street with diminished stature and an air of a man who had once glanced over a precipice and stepped back just in time. Charges for theft and tampering were quietly arranged into something less ruinous, largely, Miss Marple suspected, because several respectable gentlemen who had invested with Colonel Hemsley had no wish to see their names paraded in court. David Thornton stayed, somewhat surprisingly. There was stubbornness in the young man, beneath the cigarettes and nerves. He began painting again, this time village scenes rather than distant bazaars. Miss Marple noticed an unfinished canvas propped in his cottage window, the vicarage lawn at dusk, the striped marquees ghostly white against the dark hedges. When their paths crossed, he raised his hat with a new kind of seriousness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with experience. Inspector Slack visited Miss Marple one afternoon under the respectable pretext of returning a misdelivered parcel. He hovered, cleared his throat, and at last said gruffly, "You know, Miss Marple, that business with the delayed action stuff and the coffee, well, I might have overlooked it. At first." Miss Marple poured him tea, unsweetened, out of courtesy to recent memories, and replied mildly, "It is very hard, Inspector, to catch a man who uses his head and waits. People are so much more interested in dramatics than in patience." Slack grunted, but there was a reluctant respect in it. "You see things," he said. "Little things. Things I'd call nothing." "They are never nothing," Miss Marple answered, adding a biscuit to his saucer. "They are people, Inspector, and people in the end always tell you what they are going to do, if you have the patience to listen." When he had gone, and the village quiet folded back around her cottage, Miss Marple took the tiny brass key from her mantelpiece and turned it thoughtfully in her fingers. The cipher box itself had been packed away as evidence, but the key remained, an elegant, unnecessary thing now, freed from purpose. "What a fuss," she said softly to herself, placing it at last into a little china dish along with odd buttons and fragments of ribbon. Over an empty box, and yet not empty at all, really. It held everyone's hopes, fears, and greed quite comfortably. Outside, the evening light softened the thatched roofs and hedgerows of St. Mary Mead until the village looked as peaceful and harmless as any postcard. But Miss Marple knew better. Human nature, she reflected, was rather like that brass key, Small, easily overlooked, but capable, in the right or wrong lock, of opening very dangerous doors indeed. Winter crept early into St. Mary Mead that year. Frost etched delicate patterns on cottage windows, and smoke curled steadily from chimneys long before twilight. The village had not forgotten the Cairo Bazaar, but its sharp outlines had begun to blur, like ink left out in the rain. People still spoke of it, of course. English villages always do. But now it came out in fragments over mending baskets and shop counters, its horror softened by repetition and distance. For Miss Marple, however, it had settled into its proper place. One more pattern in a long tapestry of human behavior, distinct yet curiously familiar. On a particularly cold afternoon, she sat by her fire with her knitting in her lap, something warm and practical for one of her many godchildren, when a hesitant knock sounded at the door. It was David Thornton, awkward in his well-worn overcoat, his hands stained with paint. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple," he began. Well, I wanted to thank you. Had things gone a little differently, I might have been hanged for a murder someone else had already committed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You would not have been hanged, Mr. Thornton. Inspector Slack is many things, but he is not actually fond of hanging the wrong people. Still, you did skirt peril rather closely." He flushed. "I behaved abominably. The rage, the wanting my money back at any cost, it's not pleasant to think about. I've taken some of my paintings to London, sold 2 already. I'm repaying what I can to those who were swindled in Cairo. It's not much, but—" "It's quite a great deal," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Very few people are willing to tidy up the moral consequences after the excitement of the crime has passed, attempted or otherwise. It speaks well for you, Mr. Thornton." After he left, lighter in step than when he arrived, Miss Marple reflected that he would likely be all right. People who could feel shame usually were. A week later, Mrs. Lydia Hemsley sent a letter from the remand prison. The hand was firm, the lines even. "You saw me clearly, Miss Marple," it read. "I do not repent wishing Alistair dead. I only regret that another hand did the deed first. Still, you were right. He had long since poisoned all our lives. I take some cold comfort in knowing at least one of his planned futures was denied him. Do not trouble yourself over me. I have been living in a prison of his making for years. This one has bars. That is all." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it with several others in a small box marked correspondence. Interesting. It was not approval Lydia sought, only recognition, and that Miss Marple could quietly grant. The village itself settled back into its familiar shape, though with certain adjustments. The vicar worked sermons on forgiveness and restitution rather more often into his calendar. Mrs. Price Ridley made a pointed, if somewhat strained, effort to avoid condemning foreign influences quite so frequently. Even Inspector Slack, on his next visit, stood awkwardly on Miss Marple's hearthrug and admitted, in his own gruff fashion, that psychology and that might occasionally have its uses. "Facts first, Miss Marple," he insisted. "Always facts. But I suppose how people behave with the facts, that does matter." "It is usually the deciding factor," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes kind, though there was a touch of mischief in them as well. On the mantelpiece, the tiny brass key still lay beside a china shepherdess. The cipher box itself had gone off to be catalogued and forgotten, but Miss Marple had chosen to keep the key, an object made to open something that, in the end, had contained nothing at all of what people believed in it. "I suppose," she remarked later to Mrs. Bantry over tea, "that the real cipher was never in Arabic or carved in wood. It was in the way people read what they wanted into that box. Treasure, escape, revenge. They all translated it according to their own desires. And you, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "What did you see in it?" "Why, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her needles beginning to click once more. "Only what one always sees, if one pays attention. Human nature. It is, in the end, the only language worth mastering. Once you can read that, the rest is mostly a matter of patience." Outside, the church clock struck 4. The sound rolled gently over the thatched roofs and neat hedges of St. Mary Mead, returning the village to its quiet routine. Somewhere a kettle whistled, somewhere a child laughed, somewhere, unheard but not unfelt, the echoes of a murdered man's choices still moved through altered lives. Miss Marple counted her stitches, satisfied that, for now at least, everything important had come out even.